It was well past 10 when Ethan Walker's car pulled into the driveway of his quiet suburban home on the outskirts of Seattle. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the streets still glistened under the dim streetlights. The neighborhood was silent, as it always was at this time of night, just the way Ethan preferred it. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. Originally, he had planned to spend the weekend in San Francisco, finalizing a merger that would take his tech startup to the next level. But a phone call from his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kinley, had unsettled him. "I saw someone unfamiliar going in and out of your house," she'd said, concern thick in her voice. She looked young. Sweet, maybe. But I thought you should know. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who let emotions dictate his actions, but something in her voice stayed with him. Without explanation, he cut his trip short and booked the first flight home. Now, standing in front of his own front door, he felt a strange tightness in his chest. The house was dark, save for a soft golden glow seeping from the living room window. He entered quietly. The foyer was silent. His footsteps were muffled against the polished hardwood floor. He made his way to the living room, and froze. There, curled up on the couch, was Grace Miller. Her shoes were neatly placed beside her, a thin throw blanket draped over her knees. Cradled against her chest was his 6-year-old son Oliver, fast asleep, his small hand clutching her cardigan. Grace was new. She had started just 2 weeks ago, recommended by a family friend after Ethan's last nanny resigned unexpectedly. He remembered the interview, her quiet composure, the calm way she spoke to Oliver, and the fact that somehow his usually reserved son had opened up to her almost immediately. But this? Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but firm.
"What the hell is going on here?"
Grace startled awake. Her eyes widened when she saw him. I'm sorry," she stammered, gently shifting Oliver so he lay comfortably on the couch. "He had a nightmare. I was reading to him, and he asked me to stay until he fell asleep. I must have dozed off."
Étonnesse expression d'Arkend.
"This isn't what I hired you for. You're a nanny, not a member of this family."
"You don't sleep on my couch, holding my son."
Grace stood slowly. "Mr. Walker, I didn't mean to overstep. Oliver was. I don't care what he was. You're not his mother." The words came out sharper than he intended, and for a moment, something flickered across Grace's face. Hurt? Maybe. But she simply nodded. "I understand," she said softly.
"Elle gâtait my things."
She left the room without another word. Ethan stood there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest. Oliver didn't stir. The boy had always had trouble sleeping. Since his mother passed away, the nights were hardest. There were weeks when he'd wake up screaming, calling for someone who would never come back. Grace had changed that, Ethan knew it. He didn't want to admit it, but ever since she started, Oliver had been sleeping through the night. He smiled more, talked more, played music again, things he hadn't done in months. And now she was gone. A soft sound broke his thoughts.
Oliver stirred, blinking sleepily.
"Daddy," he murmured.
"Amir, buddy."
Oliver sat up, looking around the room.
"Where's Grace?"
Ethan hesitated. She had to leave. The boy frowned. Why? She did something she shouldn't have.
Oliver's face crumpled.
She didn't. She read me a story and stayed until I wasn't scared anymore. That's not wrong. Ethan sat beside him, unsure how to respond. The sincerity in his son's voice hit him harder than he expected. "You don't understand," Ethan said quietly. "I have to protect you." "She was protecting me too," Oliver whispered. "You just couldn't see it." Later that night, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat alone in his office.
The silence of the house was louder than usual.
He opened his laptop and pulled up the home security footage. The motion sensor recording from earlier that evening was corrupt.
A brief system error, nothing unusual, but no inconvénient.
The timing couldn't have been worse. He leaned back in his chair, frustrated. He didn't know Grace well. He wasn't used to strangers in his home, especially not around Oliver. And yet, something about her had seemed so genuine. He stared at the screen, then closed the laptop. Upstairs, Oliver had cried himself to sleep. The next morning, Ethan tried to carry on as normal. He made breakfast, got Oliver ready for school, but the house felt different. colder, quieter, as if something essential had been removed. He found a small note tucked beneath Oliver's pillow, written in childish scrawl.
Grace, please come back. I promise I won't have nightmares anymore if you're here.
I miss you. Love, Oliver. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the note. He didn't believe in fixing things with emotion. He believed in logic, in control. But logic couldn't explain why his son had smiled more in the past 2 weeks than in the entire year before that. He couldn't ignore that. By noon, Ethan was driving toward the address listed on Grace's job application. It was a small apartment complex, clearly on the lower end of town. The kind of place that made him feel out of place in his tailored jacket and polished shoes. He hesitated before knocking on apartment 2C. Grace answered after a moment, surprise flashing across her face. Mr. Walker? I wanted to talk, he said simply.
About last night.
Grace stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was tidy but modest, well lived in. There were textbooks on the table, a half-packed bag by the door. I figured you wouldn't want to see me again, she said. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. She waited. I overreacted, Ethan admitted. I made assumptions. That's on me. Grace folded her arms, not cold, but guarded. I wasn't trying to take anyone's place, she said. I was just trying to help Oliver feel safe. I know. Ethan glanced around the apartment. You were good for him. Better than I expected anyone could be. Grace softened slightly.
Why are you here, Ethan?
Because I'm asking you to come back. Not for me. For Oliver. She studied him a moment, then said quietly.
I'll come back.
But on one condition. Name it. I'm not just the help. If I come back, I want to be treated like someone who matters. Ethan nodded. Fair enough. And just like that, the first thread of trust was rewoven, not perfect, not complete, but enough to begin again. When Grace returned to the Walker residence the next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't about the furniture or the lighting or the layout, those were the same. It was the silence.
A softé kind of silence.
Not the cold, heavy stillness of suspicion, but the tentative quiet of something fragile being pieced back together. Oliver was the first to see her. He raced down the stairs barefoot, still in his dinosaur pajamas, eyes wide with disbelief. Then, without hesitation, he threw his arms around her legs. You came back, he mumbled into her coat.
I thought you were gone forever.
Grace bent down and hugged him tight. I told you I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. But you did. I didn't want to, she whispered. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes too. Ethan watched from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, the steam curling up into his face like a veil. He wasn't sure what to say or how to say it. Last night, driving home from Grace's apartment, he'd gone over every possible way to apologize again. But now, watching her with his son, all the words seemed redundant. He cleared his throat. Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. I reset the security system, he said. And I left a spare key in the kitchen drawer.
In case you need it.
Grace nodded slowly. Thank you. They didn't speak of what had happened. Not that day. Or the next. Instead, life resumed. Oliver insisted on resuming their bedtime reading rituals. Grace would sit at the edge of his bed, reading with her soft, steady voice until his eyelids drooped and the weight of the day slipped away. She helped him with his music again, guiding his small fingers over the piano keys, encouraging him each time he missed a note. Ethan often lingered outside the room, listening. Not just to the music, but to the laughter, the warmth, the sounds of something whole forming where something broken had once existed. Still, Ethan remained cautious. Not because of Grace, but because of himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was navigating unfamiliar ground. Vulnerability had never served him well, not in business, not in marriage, and certainly not in grief. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the evergreens in the backyard, Ethan stood by the window, sipping his second cup of coffee. Grace stepped in quietly, holding a folded sheet of paper. Oliver wanted to show you this, she said. It was a drawing. 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium-sized with long hair, and one small one holding both of their hands. Above them, in shaky handwriting, it read, My family. Ethan stared at it longer than necessary. He asked if it's okay to call me his Grace Mom, she added, almost shyly. I told him maybe he should ask you. Ethan's chest tightened. He looked up. What did you say when he asked why his real mom isn't in the picture? I said sometimes people leave because their bodies can't stay, even if their love wants to. He set the drawing down gently on the kitchen counter. You're good with him. I try to be. He hesitated, then asked, do you ever regret coming here?
Grace haute fort un moment.
I don't regret coming back, she said. But I was scared.
Of me.
Of getting close. Of being reminded that I'm temporary. You're not, he said quietly, then added, at least I hope not. There was a beat of silence, and in that silence, something subtle shifted. The days that followed felt warmer. Grace began to share more, about her past, her dreams, the nights she studied alone in the library to get through community college, the time she spent working 3 jobs just to keep her younger sister in school. Ethan listened. And for the first time in years, he opened up too. He told her about Lauren, his late wife. About how her illness had come fast and stayed long. How he'd prepared himself for her death on paper, with lawyers and insurance policies, but never in his heart. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his mother won't ever come home again? He asked one night, sitting on the porch steps beside her. You don't, Grace replied. You just sit with them while they figure it out. He looked over at her, eyes tired but soft. I wish someone had sat with me. I'm here now, she said, not as a promise, but as a truth.
The word unidère, qui est unsteady.
And slowly, almost imperceptibly, trust began to settle in their home like dust in the morning light. But life has a way of testing the things we cherish, just when we start to believe they're safe. A week later, Ethan arrived home earlier than usual. The house was empty. Grace had taken Oliver to a music workshop downtown. On the kitchen island sat a thick envelope labeled, Confidential. It had been slipped through the front mail slot. Curious, he opened it. Inside were screenshots. Emails. Logs. A printout of a conversation thread from a Slack account that he didn't recognize, until he saw Grace's name at the top of one of the messages. It was dated 2 weeks ago.
The text read.
He keeps everything on his personal laptop. If I can get it, it might be enough to pay off Rachel's tuition. I'm not asking for much, just a few documents. Ethan stared at the page, pulse rising. His first thought was disbelief. His second, anger. Was this what it had all been about? The kindness, the care, the comfort she offered Oliver, had it all been calculated? He wanted to throw the envelope away, but he couldn't. The words were right there. The date. Her name.
The implication.
All pointing toward betrayal. When Grace and Oliver returned later that evening, Ethan barely spoke. He watched her closely, noting every movement, every glance, searching for the lie beneath the surface. Grace noticed the change immediately. Is something wrong? He didn't answer. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, the envelope on the table in front of him. The weight of it was unbearable. He remembered the way Grace held Oliver during his nightmares. The way she encouraged him to try again every time he stumbled on the piano. The way she looked at Ethan, not with calculation, but care. But the evidence was right there. He had opened his home again. His son's heart. His own. And now it seemed, everything was unraveling. What if he had been wrong about her from the beginning? What if, once again, he had trusted the wrong person? Ethan didn't sleep that night. He spent hours in his study, the faint glow of the desk lamp illuminating the envelope on the table. His fingers hovered over it, unable to dismiss the weight of the screenshots and the message that had shattered the fragile trust he'd built with Grace. The image of Grace sitting by Oliver's bedside, reading him stories, her gentle voice comforting the boy who hadn't known peace for so long, it all felt like a lie now. The idea that she might have been after something all along gnawed at him. He couldn't reconcile the warm, selfless woman he saw with the person in the emails. The following morning, Ethan's mind was a storm. He told himself that he was overreacting, that there must be some explanation, some context to the words on the page that he hadn't understood yet. But deep down, a part of him already knew what he had to do next. When Grace and Oliver returned from their morning outing, the air in the house felt thick with tension. Oliver, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, darted past his father, calling out for Grace. Grace. Guess what? I learned a new song. Ethan didn't respond to his son. His gaze was fixed on Grace as she entered the kitchen, dropping her bag on the counter. Good morning, she said, her voice light, but there was a subtle unease in her eyes when she saw the expression on his face. Ethan didn't greet her back. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. Then slowly, he slid the envelope across the counter towards her. Grace's eyes flicked to it, and in that instant, Ethan saw the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for it. I don't know what this is, Ethan, she said softly, but her voice betrayed her nerves. She opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the papers quickly. Her face remained unreadable, but he could see her trying to control her emotions. I didn't want to do this, she said, her voice tight. I was going to tell you. I didn't want you to find out like this. Ethan's chest tightened.
Tell me what, Grace?
I made a mistake. A big one. When I came here, I was struggling. I didn't know how I was going to pay for my sister's college tuition, how I was going to keep her dreams alive.
Rachel Saleh-Yavleft.
And when you offered me this job, it felt like a lifeline. But I made the wrong choice. I asked someone I thought I could trust, someone who told me they could help me. Her voice wavered, but she held his gaze steadily. It wasn't about you. Or Oliver. It wasn't about taking advantage of your generosity. It was about making sure my sister could get an education. I never meant to hurt you or betray you. Ethan was silent, processing her words. The weight of it was crushing. So, you were willing to compromise everything for money? No, Grace's voice was firm now, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. Shame, yes, but also a kind of quiet strength. I was willing to do whatever it took to keep my family together. I never meant to get entangled in this mess. But when I realized what I'd done, I couldn't take it back. Ethan closed his eyes, running a hand through his hair. You should have told me, Grace.
He trusted you. He trusted you with my son.
I know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm sorry. I should have come clean the moment I realized the mistake I was making. The silence between them stretched long. Ethan felt as if the floor beneath him had shifted. The feelings he'd been fighting all week, betrayal, anger, hurt, seemed to dissolve, replaced with a sense of understanding that both surprised and exhausted him. Grace wasn't the villain he had pictured in his mind, the manipulative person who had schemed behind his back. She was a young woman trying to make the best of a situation, trying to protect her family from falling apart. She made a terrible mistake, but that didn't mean she was a terrible person. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice soft. So you've been working with someone to steal from me? She shook her head. No. It wasn't like that. I never took anything. I never intended to. But when I was given the opportunity to take documents, just a few, it felt like the only way to fix everything. I got scared. I thought I was out of options. Did you get what you needed? Ethan asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Grace hesitated, then nodded. Did you plan to leave? He pressed, the weight of the question hanging in the air. I didn't want to, she whispered. I didn't want to hurt you or Oliver. I wanted to be here. I love being here.
Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind stirring.
You should have told me the truth from the beginning.
Grace's lips parted, une word calm.
She nodded, unable to defend herself further. Ethan's thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and frustration. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to cut through the layers of masks they wore. But with Grace, everything was different. He had seen the sincerity in her eyes when she cared for Oliver. He had seen the way she had worked to help him overcome his fears, his nightmares. But then the betrayal. The possibility that someone he had trusted was deceiving him from the inside. He turned away and walked toward the door, his hand on the knob. I need some time, he said, his voice quiet. To think. Grace didn't follow him, and Oliver was still too young to understand what was happening. He sat at the table, watching his father leave, his small hands clutching the drawing from earlier. Ethan stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. The crisp morning air felt like a slap to his face. He walked to the edge of the driveway, stopping just short of the street. His thoughts were racing, but his emotions were quiet. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to believe. He didn't know if he could forgive Grace, or if he should. All he knew was that he was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of holding up walls that didn't keep out the things that really mattered. And tired of pretending that he had all the answers when, in reality, he didn't even know where to start. Grace had made a mistake. A big one. But the question now was whether he could find a way to move past it. Whether in the end, trust could be rebuilt, or if the damage was too deep. And if it was too deep, what would that mean for Oliver? Ethan spent the following days in a haze, trying to reconcile the image of Grace that had been shattered in his mind with the reality of the woman who had cared for his son. His emotions were a tangled knot, hurt and betrayal mixed with a surprising undercurrent of understanding. His mind kept returning to the same question: could he really move past this? Oliver had become withdrawn, sensing the change between his father and Grace. He no longer ran to greet her when she arrived in the morning, and his bright eyes had lost some of their sparkle. Ethan noticed it too. The boy missed her in a way he couldn't fully express, but his heart seemed to ache with every passing day of distance. Grace, for her part, had kept her distance. She did her best to carry out her duties as if nothing had changed, but the air between them was thick with unresolved tension. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but she refused to leave without a final chance to prove herself. Every night, when she said goodnight to Oliver, her voice held a note of sorrow. It was as if she were silently asking for forgiveness with each word.
One rainy Friday evening, everything changed.
Ethan had just returned from a long meeting with investors and walked into the house, weary from the day's demands. He was barely through the door when he heard Oliver's voice, crying out in fear. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was the kind of cry that no father could ignore. "Oliver," he called out, his voice shaking slightly. He rushed toward his son's room. What he saw made his heart stop. The living room light flickered on, revealing a nightmare. Oliver was standing by the staircase, his eyes wide with terror. His hands gripped the banister as if he were trying to hold onto something solid, something that would keep him from falling. And standing behind him, looking like a ghost, was Grace, her face pale, her breathing shallow. She was barely standing, her body trembling. "Grace," Ethan said, his voice urgent. I couldn't." Grace's voice was barely audible as she took a few halting steps toward Ethan, her face etched with pain. "He was in the kitchen, and I heard him scream. He fell. He was crying, so scared."
Ethan's eyes widened.
He rushed to Oliver, kneeling down beside him. "Buddy, what happened? Are you hurt?" Oliver, his body trembling, clung to his father, his little hands clutching his shirt.
He heard something.
"I didn't know what it was, and then the lights started to flicker. I didn't know what was happening, Dad. I didn't know." Ethan's heart ached as he held Oliver close, but it was Grace's voice that broke him from his thoughts. "I saw him fall. He was heading toward the stairs, and the lights flickered again. I grabbed him, but we both fell. I couldn't catch him." Ethan turned to Grace. "Are you both okay?" Grace nodded, but her eyes were clouded with fear. "I think so. I don't know what happened." "Come on, let's get Oliver settled," Ethan said, gently lifting his son into his arms. His mind was racing. It wasn't like Oliver to be so shaken, so afraid. Grace moved to follow him as he took Oliver upstairs, but Ethan held up a hand to stop her. He didn't say anything, but the silent tension between them was palpable. He needed a moment with his son, just the two of them.
Upstairs, Ethan carefully lay Oliver in bed.
He sat beside him, his hand resting lightly on his son's arm. "What did you hear, Oliver?"
"Can you tell me?"
Oliver sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "It was like something was coming. I thought it was Mom, but it wasn't." Ethan's heart broke for his son. He had been so young when Lauren died, so young that he hadn't been able to fully understand why his mother was gone. The nightmares had started soon after. For a while, they seemed to subside, but now, it was clear they had come back with a vengeance. "Listen to me, Oliver," Ethan said, his voice tender. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Okay? It's just the house.
Sometimes things happen in the dark.
But I'm here.
I'm not going anywhere."
Oliver nodded slowly, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Ethan took a deep breath.
"You know Grace is here, right?"
"She's here because she cares about you. She cares about both of us." Oliver nodded again, but this time, a tear escaped down his cheek.
I'm scared, Daddy.
I don't want her to leave. Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what was going to happen. But in that moment, he realized something profound. Grace hadn't just been helping Oliver. She had been helping him too. She had filled the gaps that his grief had left. She had soothed his son when Ethan couldn't, offered a kind of healing that had been absent from their lives for so long. Ethan stayed with Oliver until he fell asleep, his breathing steady and calm. Once he was sure his son was comfortable, Ethan quietly left the room, closing the door gently behind him. In the hallway, Grace stood, her face pale and exhausted. She had heard everything, every word, every pause. And when Ethan finally met her eyes, there was nothing left between them but raw honesty. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never meant for any of this to happen. I only wanted to make things better for him, for both of you. Ethan took a step closer, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to apologize anymore, Grace. You've already done more than I could have asked for. She looked up at him, her eyes full of vulnerability. I wasn't just trying to protect him, Grace said quietly. I was trying to protect myself too. Ethan reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. I know. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The house was still, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards. And then, as if a weight had been lifted, Ethan spoke again, his voice steady. Grace, I don't know where this goes. But I want you to stay. I want us to figure this out. Together. Tears filled her eyes.
I'm not going anywhere.
That night, Ethan slept soundly for the first time in weeks. He didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was no longer fighting the world alone. There was a chance for healing, for forgiveness, for something new to grow out of the wreckage. The darkness hadn't disappeared. But with Grace's presence in his life, it was beginning to feel like it might one day fade. The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of healing. Ethan spent more time with Oliver, comforting him through his fears, and he noticed that the nightmares began to subside. There were no more tears in the middle of the night, no more frantic calls for help. Oliver's laughter had returned, soft but steady, like a small warm flame that had been rekindled. Grace, too, seemed to find her place in the household once more. She no longer walked on eggshells around Ethan, nor did she withdraw. There was a gentleness in the way she interacted with both Ethan and Oliver, as though she had finally allowed herself to believe that she truly belonged here. That her presence wasn't temporary, wasn't a mistake. She had a place, and that place was with them, in their lives. But even as the atmosphere in the house grew warmer, there remained an underlying uncertainty. Ethan's trust in Grace had been shaken, and while they had mended many of the cracks, there were still remnants of doubt, still moments when he questioned whether she had truly changed or if the past would resurface. One Friday evening, Ethan decided it was time to confront the elephant in the room. It was long overdue. He invited Grace to sit with him on the back porch after Oliver had gone to bed. The night air was crisp, the stars barely visible behind the heavy clouds that hung low. Ethan took a deep breath and looked at Grace, who was sitting across from him, her hands clasped in her lap. I've been thinking a lot, Ethan began, his voice calm but steady. About everything that's happened. About what you said, about what I said. Grace met his gaze, her face unreadable but her eyes reflecting something deeper, vulnerability, understanding, perhaps even regret. I think we need to talk about it. The trust. What happened? What's still left between us? She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her pants. I know you're still holding on to doubt, Ethan, she said softly. And I get it. What I did, what I almost did, it's not something that can just go away with a few kind words. I know that. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. It's not just about what you almost did, Grace. It's about what you did to us. To me.
He let you into our lives, into my son's life.
And you betrayed that trust. And I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. But, he hesitated, his thoughts shifting. I also have to ask myself, why am I still here?
Why am I giving you another chance?
Grace remained silent, her eyes lowered, her lips pressed together in contemplation. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees filled the space between them. Ethan continued, I think it's because, despite everything, I see the person you've been for Oliver. The way you've cared for him, the way you've been there. I see the way you've tried to fix what you broke. And maybe, just maybe, I see myself in you. Grace looked up, her eyes widening. What do you mean? I mean, Ethan said, his voice softer now, that I've been broken too. For so long, I was just going through the motions, trying to be a father, trying to be a businessman, trying to be everything. But I was never really present.
Il est my grief, my enjeu, my pride keep me distant.
And then you came along, and for the first time in years, someone was there for Oliver. Not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. Grace's expression softened, and for a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of the past few months settling over them like a quiet storm. I'm sorry, Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I was doing the right thing, and I let fear and desperation get in the way. But I can't undo what I've done. All I can do is show you that I'm not that person anymore. Ethan nodded, the words lingering in the air between them. The truth was, he wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the woman who had been there for Oliver, who had helped him through his darkest moments, was the same woman who had made that mistake in the past. He could see the remorse in her eyes, but more than that, he could see the desire to be better. To be real.
To be trusted.
I believe you, Ethan finally said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. But I need time. Time to really rebuild what was broken. And it's not just about you, Grace. It's about me too. About learning to trust again. It's not easy. But I'm willing to try. For you. For Oliver. A small relieved smile appeared on Grace's face. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears that she refused to shed. I'll wait, she said quietly. I'll wait however long it takes. Months passed, and slowly, Ethan and Grace began to rebuild their lives. The house no longer felt like a battleground, but a home. Ethan didn't rush the process. He didn't try to force things into a neat, comfortable box. Instead, he let the relationship evolve organically, like the delicate first sprouts of a new season. Oliver continued to flourish under Grace's care. He played the piano more often, his small fingers growing more confident with each passing week. His nightmares became fewer, replaced by quiet nights spent drawing, reading, or simply sitting with Grace and Ethan as they talked. And then one evening, as Ethan was finishing up a late work call, Oliver came into the room, holding something behind his back. His eyes were wide with excitement. Daddy, he said, I have something for you. Ethan put his phone down and gave his full attention to his son. What is it, buddy? Oliver hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, revealing a drawing he had made. It was a simple sketch, but it was clear who the figures were, Ethan, Grace, and himself. The three of them, holding hands. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Family. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He looked up at Grace, who was standing in the doorway, a soft smile on her face. That's us, Oliver said with a proud grin. Ethan looked at the drawing again, then back at his son. It is. It's us. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized that family wasn't just about blood. It wasn't about mistakes or past wrongs. Family was about the choices we made, the people we chose to love, the ones we chose to trust, and the ones who chose to stay. Thank you, Ethan whispered to Grace, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for staying. Grace walked over to him, and together, they looked at the drawing, at the simple truth that had emerged from the pain, the healing, and the forgiveness. We're just getting started, she said, her voice warm and steady. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was walking alone. He wasn't just a man who had lost everything. He was a man who had found a new kind of family, a family made not by circumstance, but by choice.